December 20th, 1944. Luxembourg City, Allied Forward Headquarters. A telephone conversation between two American generals would expose fault lines that had threatened the Western Alliance for nearly 3 years. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, received orders from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower that would temporarily place 2 American field armies under British operational control. The decision came during Germany's Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces had created a dangerous salient in American lines. Bradley's response, documented in declassified communications logs, was uncharacteristic for the normally diplomatic Midwesterner. He protested the command transfer with unusual vehemence, citing responsibility to the American public and threatening resignation. Eisenhower's reply, equally documented, was blunt. Ultimate accountability rested with the Supreme Commander, not subordinate Army group leaders. This exchange represented more than wartime crisis management. It crystallized years of accumulated friction between American military leaders and British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. By late 1944, Montgomery had become what military historians term a coalition friction point, an officer whose undeniable tactical abilities were increasingly offset by his corrosive effect on Allied unity. The question facing historians examining this period is straightforward. How did an officer celebrated in Britain as a national hero become so deeply resented by America's senior military leadership? The answer requires examining not individual incidents in isolation, but a pattern of behavior spanning 3 years and 4 major campaigns. If you're interested in evidence-based analysis of World War II command relationships, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what aspects of Allied cooperation interest you most. To understand American frustrations with Montgomery requires understanding the military and political context of 1942-1943. When American forces entered the North African campaign following Operation Torch in November 1942, they joined a coalition where Britain had been fighting for over 3 years. British military doctrine, British command structures, and British officers naturally dominated Allied planning. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army, which by early 1943 had driven German and Italian forces westward from Egypt through Libya. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein in October-November 1942 had reversed Britain's fortunes in North Africa and made him a celebrated figure. His methodical approach, emphasizing careful preparation, overwhelming material superiority, and limited risk-taking, reflected both his personality and Britain's strategic situation. British casualties since 1939 had been substantial. The nation's manpower reserves were limited compared to the Soviet Union or United States. British commanders had learned through painful defeats in France, Greece, and early North African campaigns that reckless offensive action produced disasters. Montgomery's careful methods, which some American officers would later criticize as overcautious, made perfect sense for a nation that could not afford another military catastrophe. American forces in North Africa initially consisted of the 2nd Corps, comprising the 1st Infantry Division, 1st Armored Division, and 9th Infantry Division, with additional units arriving throughout early 1943. These were largely untested formations. While individual American soldiers had trained extensively, the units had not faced combat against veteran German troops. American combined arms doctrine, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, existed in theory but had not been proven in battle. General Sir Harold Alexander commanded the 18th Army Group, which oversaw all Allied ground forces in Tunisia. Alexander's background epitomized British military tradition, educated at Harrow, commissioned into the Irish Guards, decorated in the First World War, and experienced in colonial warfare. His military judgment was sound, but his assessment of American combat potential was influenced by British assumptions about military professionalism and American inexperience. The command structure reflected political reality. Britain provided experienced leadership and proven formations, while America contributed growing numbers and industrial capacity. This arrangement was logical in early 1943, but would become increasingly problematic as American force contributions expanded. February 14-25, 1943. The Kasserine Pass offensive exposed American tactical deficiencies with brutal clarity. German forces under Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, launched coordinated attacks against American positions in central Tunisia. The assault employed experienced units, including the 10th Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division, supported by Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft. American units, positioned in dispersed defensive arrangements, were defeated in detail as German armor exploited gaps in the defensive line. Declassified after-action reports document specific failures: inadequate coordination between infantry and armor, artillery positions vulnerable to armored assault, and command communications that broke down under German pressure. The 1st Armored Division, spread across multiple defensive sectors, could not concentrate effectively when German armor achieved breakthrough. American casualties exceeded 6,000, including nearly 300 killed and over 3,000 captured. Alexander's assessment, documented in official reports to the combined chiefs of staff, was harsh. He noted American command difficulties, inadequate tactical coordination, and insufficient training for armored warfare. His conclusions influenced subsequent operational planning. American forces should receive supporting missions under British oversight until they gained combat experience. Montgomery's 8th Army, approaching Tunisia from the east, faced different challenges. German forces under Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group Africa, had established defensive positions along the Mareth Line. Montgomery's attack, scheduled for mid-March 1943, would employ experienced divisions that had fought continuously since El Alamein. General George Patton assumed command of the 2nd Corps on March 6, 1943. His mission was twofold: restore American combat effectiveness and prove that American arms could perform effectively against veteran German formations. Patton's command style emphasized aggressive leadership, strict discipline, and offensive spirit. His diary entries from this period, now in the National Archives, document his determination to demonstrate American competence despite British skepticism. March 17-23, 1943. El Guetar, Central Tunisia. Patton's the 2 Corps launched supporting attacks designed to draw German attention from Montgomery's Mareth Line offensive. The operational plan assigned American forces secondary missions while the 8th Army executed the primary assault. This division of responsibilities reflected Alexander's assessment of relative American and British capabilities. The Battle of El Guetar on March 23 provided evidence contradicting British assumptions. The 10th Panzer Division, attempting to disrupt American positions, advanced into carefully prepared defensive zones. American artillery, the 1st Infantry Division's artillery battalions supported by Corps-level assets, delivered concentrated fire that destroyed German vehicles and disrupted attack formations. Tank destroyer battalions, employing 75mm and 3-inch guns positioned to exploit terrain advantages, engaged German armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Combat reports document destruction of approximately 30 German tanks and assault guns during the day's fighting. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew after failing to achieve breakthrough, marking the first significant American defensive success against German armor. Montgomery's Mareth Line offensive, launched March 2027, initially achieved limited progress. The 50th Infantry Division's frontal assault made minimal gains against prepared German defensive positions. Montgomery adapted by shifting his main effort to an outflanking movement through the Tebaga Gap, employing the 2nd New Zealand Division and armored formations. This demonstrated Montgomery's tactical flexibility, recognizing when initial plans required modification. However, Alexander's headquarters provided minimal recognition of 2 Corps' contribution. Official communiques emphasized 8th Army operations while treating American actions as minor supporting efforts. British press coverage, which American officers monitored closely, presented the Tunisia campaign as primarily a British victory with American assistance. This pattern would repeat throughout subsequent campaigns. American forces achieved tactical successes, but recognition from British commanders and British media remained limited. The psychological impact on American officers was significant, creating perceptions that British commanders would not acknowledge American competence, regardless of battlefield evidence. April-May 1943. Allied planning for Operation Husky, the Sicily invasion. Strategic debates over Sicily revealed fundamental differences in American and British operational approaches. Initial planning, conducted at the January 1943 Casablanca Conference, had established Sicily as the next Allied objective after Tunisia. However, specific operational plans remained contested. Montgomery opposed dispersed landing plans that would scatter Allied forces across multiple Sicilian beaches. His experience in North Africa had convinced him that concentration of force was essential. Dispersed landings, in his assessment, invited defeat in detail if Axis forces concentrated against isolated beachheads. His alternative proposal called for concentrated landings in southeastern Sicily, giving 8th Army a clear axis of advance toward Messina. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, commanding Mediterranean Air Forces, and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding Mediterranean Naval Forces, opposed Montgomery's plan on operational grounds. Concentrated landings would leave Axis airfields operational, threatening the invasion fleet. Naval vessels would remain concentrated in limited waters, vulnerable to air attack and submarine operations. The dispute escalated when Montgomery threatened to resign if forced to execute plans he considered fundamentally flawed. This represented Montgomery's standard negotiating tactic: present military disagreements as matters of principle, threaten resignation, and rely on political support, particularly from Churchill, to override opposition. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military requirements against coalition politics, convened a May 2nd conference to resolve the dispute. After extensive debate, he approved Montgomery's approach with modifications. Landings would concentrate in southeastern Sicily, with 8th Army advancing toward Messina and the newly designated 7th Army, under Patton, protecting 8th Army's western flank. For American planners, the decision established a problematic pattern. Montgomery's preferences determined operational plans, while American forces received supporting missions. The command arrangement reflected British operational experience and American inexperience, but it also suggested that British commanders expected this relationship to continue indefinitely. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky commenced with Allied amphibious and airborne assaults against Sicily. The operational plan assigned 8th Army the mission of advancing up Sicily's eastern coast toward Messina, while 7th Army protected 8th Army's left flank and western approaches. This mission allocation reflected Alexander's assessment that Montgomery's experienced formations should execute the primary offensive while American forces provided security. Airborne operations preceding the amphibious landings encountered significant difficulties. The 82nd Airborne Division's parachute drop scattered American paratroopers across southeastern Sicily due to high winds and navigation challenges. British glider forces suffered similar problems, with numerous gliders crashing into the Mediterranean when tow ropes parted prematurely. Despite airborne difficulties, beach landings achieved their objectives. American forces at Gela faced counterattacks from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and Italian coastal divisions. The 1st Infantry Division, supported by naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers offshore, repulsed German armor, attempting to drive American forces back into the sea. Combat reports document close coordination between ground forces and naval support, demonstrating improved American combined arms effectiveness. Montgomery's 8th Army secured Syracuse and began advancing northward toward Catania. Montgomery's initial assessments suggested limited Axis resistance, leading him to signal Alexander that the route to Messina appeared open. This assessment proved overly optimistic. German forces, particularly the 1st Parachute Division, established strong defensive positions south of Catania that channelized British attacks into prepared killing zones. By July 12th, 8th Army's advance had stalled. German paratroopers, occupying positions that exploited Sicily's mountainous terrain, inflicted casualties on attacking British formations while preventing breakthrough. Montgomery's methodical approach, effective in North African desert warfare, struggled against defenders who could concentrate forces on narrow frontages. July 12-13, 1943. Montgomery's response to tactical difficulties would poison Allied command relationships. Recognizing that frontal assaults against Catania were achieving limited progress, Montgomery signaled Alexander, proposing expansion of 8th Army's operational zone westward. This expansion would require appropriating Highway 124, a key route currently assigned to 7th Army's operational area. Montgomery's signal informed Alexander of this requirement rather than requesting approval, a subtle but significant distinction reflecting Montgomery's assumptions about command prerogatives. Alexander approved Montgomery's request on July 13th, instructing Patton to halt offensive operations and assume defensive positions while 8th Army expanded westward. The order's implications were unmistakable. British operational preferences superseded American mission assignments, and American forces would modify their operations to accommodate British requirements. Patton's response, documented in his diary and correspondence, was explosive. He characterized the decision as relegating American forces to secondary status while Montgomery pursued glory. His diary entries from this period employ colorful language describing both Montgomery and Alexander, though official communications maintained professional courtesy required by coalition warfare. However, Patton recognized opportunity. Alexander's order had instructed 7th Army to assume defensive positions, but Alexander had not prohibited offensive operations in other directions. On July 17th, Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters with a proposal. Rather than defend passively, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and primary port. Alexander, perhaps surprised by Patton's initiative, or simply relieved to redirect American energy away from 8th Army's operations, approved the proposal. This decision fundamentally altered the Sicily campaign's character. Rather than a single British offensive supported by American defensive operations, Sicily would now feature two simultaneous drives, Montgomery advancing toward Messina from the south, and Patton driving to Palermo before turning east toward Messina along Sicily's northern coast. July 17, 1943, 7th Army's drive toward Palermo demonstrated American operational tempo. Patton's command philosophy emphasized speed over methodical preparation. American formations moved rapidly across central Sicily's mountainous terrain, bypassing resistance where possible and maintaining momentum. The 2nd Armored Division, 3rd Infantry Division and 45th Infantry Division advanced on multiple axes, covering terrain at rates exceeding British planning assumptions. Italian resistance in western Sicily, conducted primarily by coastal divisions with limited mobility and firepower, collapsed under American pressure. These formations, inadequately trained and poorly equipped compared to German units, surrendered in large numbers when American forces cut their withdrawal routes. Palermo fell to American forces on July 22nd, 12 days after initial landings. The capture of Sicily's largest city and principal port represented a significant operational achievement, providing 7th Army with improved logistics infrastructure and demonstrating American offensive capability. Meanwhile, 8th Army continued fighting toward Catania and around Mount Etna's eastern slopes. German defensive positions, established in terrain favoring defense, limited British progress. Montgomery's casualties mounted as British infantry divisions conducted repeated attacks against positions where German defenders held terrain advantages. The operational contrast was significant. 7th Army, facing lighter opposition in more favorable terrain, achieved rapid advances that received substantial American press coverage. 8th Army, facing heavier resistance in difficult terrain, made slower progress that British press reports attributed to German defensive strength rather than operational difficulties. What began as operational necessity, two Allied armies advancing on separate axes, evolved into personal competition. Patton, determined to reach Messina before Montgomery and prove American operational effectiveness, drove 7th Army relentlessly. His command emphasis prioritized speed over casualties, reflecting both his personality and American strategic calculations. The United States, with vast manpower reserves and industrial capacity, could sustain higher casualty rates than Britain's depleted forces. August 17, 1943. The race to Messina, exposed fundamental differences in American and British military cultures. Patton's operational orders to subordinate commanders emphasized continuous advance regardless of obstacles. American engineers repaired roads and bridges rapidly, often under fire. Infantry divisions marched through heat and mountainous terrain at paces that strained logistics chains. The 3rd Infantry Division, advancing along Sicily's northern coast, maintained pressure on withdrawing German rearguards. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing stronger German resistance around Mount Etna, advanced methodically. British commanders, trained to minimize casualties and preserve formations for subsequent operations, refused to risk disaster pursuing speed. This approach reflected Britain's strategic situation. Limited manpower reserves meant that destroyed divisions could not be easily replaced. German forces, commanded by Generaloberst Hans Valentin Huber, recognized that Sicily could not be held against Allied superiority in numbers and air power. Beginning in early August, German units conducted fighting withdrawals toward Messina while preparing evacuation plans. The operational question became whether Allied forces could trap German units before evacuation, not whether Sicily would fall. Operation Lehrgang, the German evacuation from Sicily, executed August 11-17, demonstrated Wehrmacht operational competence. German forces established successive defensive positions covering withdrawal routes, employed extensive anti-aircraft defenses protecting Messina Strait, and coordinated movement of approximately 40,000 German troops plus vehicles and equipment to mainland Italy. Allied air and naval forces attempted to interdict the evacuation, but achieved limited success. German anti-aircraft artillery, concentrated around ferry points, created defensive zones that Allied aircraft could not penetrate without prohibitive losses. Allied naval vessels operating in restricted waters under air threat could not effectively close Messina Strait. Elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina on August 17th, several hours before British forces arrived. 7th Army had won the race, though the victory's strategic significance was limited. German forces had successfully evacuated, and the campaign's primary objective of destroying Axis forces in Sicily had not been achieved. August 1943. Sicily's aftermath revealed patterns that would define Allied command relationships. Montgomery's public response to 7th Army reaching Messina first combined gracious congratulation with subtle dismissal. His statements emphasized difficulties 8th Army had faced against German defenders, while implying that terrain rather than competence explained outcomes. British press coverage reflected this framing, celebrating 8th Army's fighting against Germans while treating 7th Army's advance as secondary. American commanders reading these assessments recognized a consistent pattern. British narratives centered British achievements regardless of objective evidence. Montgomery's operational difficulties against Catania defenses received sympathetic treatment as fighting against determined opposition. American rapid advances received treatment as exploitation of favorable circumstances against weaker enemies. 2 incidents during Sicily further damaged relationships. The first involved Patton's August 3rd and August 10th visits to evacuation hospitals, where he slapped 2 soldiers he accused of cowardice. These incidents, when revealed to senior commanders, created a scandal that nearly ended Patton's career. Eisenhower, valuing Patton's aggressive leadership, issued a reprimand, but did not relieve him. Montgomery's response to Patton's hospital incidents was characteristically judgmental. His comments to British officers suggested that such behavior confirmed assumptions about American indiscipline and emotionalism. A British commander, Montgomery implied, would never exhibit such loss of control. The second incident involved liaison arrangements. Patton had sent Montgomery a complete liaison team, including a colonel, major, and communications section. Montgomery reciprocated by dispatching a single junior lieutenant with minimal equipment. Patton returned the officer with a note stating he could not accept such inadequate representation. This incident, while seemingly minor, captured Montgomery's casual disrespect toward American commands. Patton commanded an army equal in size to 8th Army and deserved liaison officers of appropriate rank and capability. Montgomery's failure to provide them suggested he viewed 7th Army as subordinate, despite official command relationships. Summer 1944. Strategic debates following Normandy's success exposed fundamental disagreements about concluding the war. Operation Overlord, the June 6th Normandy invasion, had achieved its objectives. Allied forces had secured beachheads, built up substantial forces ashore, and by late July prepared for breakout operations. Montgomery had commanded all Allied ground forces during the initial phase, a responsibility reflecting his operational experience and political necessity of giving Britain's premier battlefield commander prominent role. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy beginning July 25th, shattered German defensive positions in western Normandy. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's First Army, followed by Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, exploited the breakthrough with rapid advances across France. Paris was liberated August 25th, amid celebrations suggesting the war might conclude by Christmas. However, September 1st brought a command change Montgomery deeply resented. Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces in Europe. Montgomery, previously commanding all ground forces, now commanded only 21st Army Group, British and Canadian forces in northwestern Europe. Bradley commanded 12th Army Group, American 1st, 3rd and 9th Armies. The change reflected military reality. American forces in Europe had grown to exceed 60 divisions, while British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20 divisions. American industrial production sustained Allied operations. American logistics, transported in American ships using American vehicles, provided material foundation for Allied offensives. Montgomery accepted the political necessity, but rejected the strategic implications. In his assessment, dispersing command authority among multiple headquarters diluted decisive leadership. Eisenhower, whatever his political skills, lacked battlefield experience to direct ground operations effectively. The Supreme Commander's role, Montgomery argued, should be limited to political coordination and logistics, while operational command remained concentrated under a single ground forces commander. The proposal had one obvious beneficiary, Montgomery himself, but Montgomery presented his case as military necessity rather than personal ambition. Eisenhower's planned strategy, advancing into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously, was strategically unsound. It dispersed resources, prevented decisive concentration, and guaranteed the war would extend into 1945. September 1944. Montgomery's alternative strategy was characteristically bold and self-centered. Rather than broad-front advance, Montgomery proposed concentrating Allied strength for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This thrust would cross the Rhine River, seize the Ruhr industrial region, and drive toward Berlin before German forces could establish coherent defenses. Montgomery would naturally command this decisive operation, with American forces providing support and flank protection. The proposal's military merits were debatable. A narrow thrust deep into Germany would create an elongated salient vulnerable to counterattack from both flanks. It required abandoning operations elsewhere, allowing German forces to concentrate against the advance. Success depended on capturing bridges intact and maintaining supply lines over hundreds of miles of contested territory. Most fundamentally, the plan assumed German resistance had collapsed to where rapid advance would face minimal opposition. Intelligence assessments did not support this assumption. German forces, while badly damaged, were withdrawing toward prepared defensive positions in Germany. Wehrmacht commanders retained organizational capability and would defend German soil more tenaciously than French territory. The proposal's political implications were unmistakable. Montgomery was requesting that American armies be subordinated to British command for an operation ensuring British forces, under British leadership, would deliver the war-ending blow. He was asking American political leaders to accept that British wisdom should guide American strength in the campaign's decisive phase. Eisenhower, balancing military requirements against coalition politics, compromised. He would not concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would give Montgomery priority for supplies and authorize a limited operation to seize Rhine bridges in the Netherlands. This operation would employ Allied airborne forces to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem, while British ground forces advanced rapidly across captured bridges to establish a bridgehead over the Rhine. September 17–25, 1944. Operation Market Garden, the attempted Rhine crossing. The operation's plan was ambitious. 3 airborne divisions, American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, plus British 1st Airborne Division, would drop near bridges over rivers and canals in the Netherlands. British XXX Corps would advance north from the Belgian border along a single highway, reaching Arnhem within 48 to 72 hours to relieve the 1st Airborne Division. The plan contained multiple risk factors that subsequent analysis identified. Intelligence had detected German armor near Arnhem, including the 2nd SS Panzer Corps refitting after Normandy fighting. These warnings were discounted by planners who believed German formations were too depleted to pose serious threats. Airborne forces landed too far from objectives due to concerns about German anti-aircraft defenses near bridges. This gave German forces time to organize defenses before paratroopers could secure objectives. The single highway XXX Corps would advance along became a death trap. British armor could not maneuver off roads bordered by marshland and canals, while German forces established blocking positions that halted the advance. At Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion secured the north end of the highway bridge and held against overwhelming odds for days, expecting relief that never arrived. XXX Corps, blocked by destroyed bridges and German counterattacks at Nijmegen, could not maintain advance schedule. German response demonstrated Wehrmacht operational resilience. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, immediately recognized the threat and rushed reinforcements to threatened sectors. German forces, far from being defeated, concentrated effectively and counterattacked with combined arms coordination. By September 25th, when the operation was abandoned, over 17,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. Approximately 6,400 British paratroopers who landed at Arnhem were casualties, most killed or captured. The Rhine remained uncrossed, German defenses in the Netherlands solidified, and Allied momentum dissipated. September-October 1944. Market Garden's failure triggered American fury at Montgomery's response. Rather than accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characterized Market Garden as 90% successful. Bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured, substantial Dutch territory liberated. That Arnhem, the operation's primary objective, had not been secured was presented as minor setback in an otherwise successful campaign. The claim was dishonest. Market Garden's purpose was establishing a Rhine bridgehead to position forces for subsequent German offensives. This had not been achieved. The operation had cost over 17,000 casualties for no strategic gain. Yet Montgomery was declaring victory through selective interpretation of results. American commanders recognized this maneuver as characteristic Montgomery behavior. When operations succeeded, credit was his alone. When operations failed, explanations involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Personal responsibility for setbacks was conspicuously absent from Montgomery's narratives. But Montgomery's most egregious offense came in subsequent weeks. As Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against strengthened German defenses, Montgomery began publicly criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. The broad front approach, he argued in comments to British press and signals to Churchill, had squandered opportunity for decisive victory. Had his plan been adopted, had he received resources and authority requested, the war would be over. This narrative ignored inconvenient realities. Montgomery had received substantial resources for Market Garden. The operation's failure resulted from flawed planning, intelligence mistakes, and underestimating German capabilities rather than inadequate support. But Montgomery's narrative transformed operational incompetence into missed opportunity supposedly caused by others' strategic short-sightedness. For American commanders, this pattern confirmed that Montgomery would never acknowledge personal error. Every setback became someone else's failure. Every success was his triumph. This suggested not just vanity, but fundamental incapacity for honest self-assessment that made Montgomery dangerous to Allied unity. December 16, 1944. German forces launched their final major Western offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, achieved complete surprise. German forces attacked through the Ardennes forest, smashing into thinly held American positions. The assault employed approximately 30 divisions, including elite panzer and panzer grenadier formations, supported by concentrated artillery and what remained of the Luftwaffe. American units in the Ardennes sector, primarily the 80 Corps divisions spread across extended frontages, were overwhelmed by German attacks. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theatre, saw 2 regiments surrounded and forced to surrender. German panzer spearheads drove toward Meuse River crossings, threatening to split Allied armies and capture Antwerp. The offensive's initial success reflected German operational security and Allied intelligence failures. Ultra-intercepts had provided warnings of German buildup, but Allied commanders assessed that Wehrmacht lacked resources for major offensive operations. This intelligence failure, combined with Allied offensive focus elsewhere, left the Ardennes sector vulnerable. For 10 days, the outcome hung in balance. German armored spearheads advanced toward critical objectives, while American forces fought desperate defensive actions. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, held the town against German attacks while waiting for relief. American artillery, often firing in direct support at point-blank ranges, broke up German attacks. Eisenhower's response demonstrated his command abilities. On December 20th, he transferred operational control of 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery. This decision reflected practical requirements. German offensive had split American forces, with 1st Army north of the Bulge and Patton's 3rd Army to the south. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was positioned to coordinate northern response, while Bradley directed southern counterattacks. December 20–31, 1944. Montgomery's military performance during the Ardennes battle was exemplary. He immediately positioned British reserves to defend Meuse crossings, ensuring that even if German armor broke through American positions, they could not cross the river. He coordinated American defensive dispositions, establishing coherent defensive lines from confused initial responses. He demonstrated under genuine crisis conditions why Britain valued his leadership. British XXX Corps moved to blocking positions covering Meuse bridges. British armor units prepared to counterattack if German forces achieved breakthroughs. Montgomery's headquarters established effective coordination with American 1st Army and 9th Army commands, providing resources and direction during critical period. However, the battle was won primarily by American forces. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne held against repeated German attacks, denying German forces a critical road junction. The 82nd Airborne Division fought defensive actions on the northern shoulder. American infantry divisions that had been overrun in initial attacks rallied and established defensive positions. American artillery inflicted devastating casualties on German armor attempting to advance. Patton's 3rd Army executed a remarkable maneuver, pivoting 90 degrees in winter conditions to counterattack the southern flank of German salient. 3rd Army's advance toward Bastogne, conducted in snow and freezing temperatures, demonstrated American operational capability at its finest. On December 26th, elements of 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne, breaking the siege. By early January, German offensive momentum had exhausted itself. Wehrmacht forces had advanced approximately 60 miles into American positions, but had failed to capture Meuse crossings or Antwerp. German casualties exceeded 100,000, including losses in armor and equipment that could not be replaced. American casualties were also substantial, approximately 90,000, including nearly 20,000 killed. But American replacement systems could sustain these losses, while German could not. January 7, 1945. Montgomery held a press conference that would poison Allied relationships for the war's remainder. The stated purpose was praising American soldiers and defending Eisenhower. What emerged was self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began by acknowledging American fighting qualities, but quickly pivoted to describing his own actions upon assuming command, actions presented as decisive interventions that saved American forces from disaster. Transcripts of the press conference, preserved in British archives, document Montgomery's precise words. He described how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had positioned British reserves to ensure German forces could not cross the Meuse, how he had thought ahead to ensure balanced dispositions. The battle, Montgomery concluded, had been most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had handled. Throughout the presentation, British actions were highlighted, Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders conspicuously absent from the narrative. Montgomery praised American soldiers while implying they had been saved by superior British leadership. He credited American courage while suggesting American commanders had been overwhelmed until British professionalism imposed order. American reaction was explosive. Bradley, reading press reports, felt profound betrayal. Montgomery had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding against overwhelming odds until German momentum exhausted itself. Patton's Third Army had executed a brilliant counterattack. American soldiers had paid in blood to defeat Germany's final gamble. Yet Montgomery's narrative minimized American contributions and elevated his own role to central importance. This was not merely vanity, it was historical theft, an attempt to rewrite American victory as British rescue. And it represented Montgomery's authentic view. He genuinely believed his intervention had saved American forces. He saw nothing inappropriate in claiming credit for a battle won overwhelmingly by troops he had commanded for less than a month. January 1945. The press conference triggered crisis threatening Allied unity. Bradley contacted Eisenhower in fury, barely constrained by military courtesy. He could not, he declared, serve under Montgomery. If Eisenhower intended permanent British command of American forces, Bradley would resign. The ultimatum was not idle threat. Bradley, normally the most diplomatic of American commanders, had reached his breaking point. Eisenhower recognized that Allied unity hung by a thread. He privately drafted a message to the combined chiefs of staff, stating plainly that he would request Montgomery's relief unless the Field Marshal apologized and ceased public criticisms. The war was being won, but whether the alliance would survive victory remained uncertain. Crisis resolution came only after intense British pressure forced Montgomery to recognize his error. On January 12th, Montgomery wrote to Eisenhower expressing regret and acknowledging his press conference had caused offense. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of commanding them temporarily. The letters were gracious and apparently sincere, but largely irrelevant. The damage was done. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Montgomery would never view them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through Montgomery's assessment of how it affected his reputation. Every failure would be explained by insufficient support or others' errors. Every success would be claimed as validation of Montgomery's wisdom. But more than personality clashes were at stake. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted decisively toward American predominance. American armies comprised over 60 divisions, while British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. Yet Montgomery continued behaving as though British wisdom must guide American strength. January-March 1945. The contradiction reflected broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of war and facing post-war economic collapse, struggled to accept that its global predominance had ended. British leaders recognized intellectually that American economic and military power now exceeded Britain's, but emotional acceptance came harder. Churchill's wartime speeches emphasized Anglo-American partnership, but underlying assumptions suggested Britain would guide the partnership while America provided resources. Montgomery's inability to adjust to these realities made him a symbol of Britain's difficulty accepting diminished status. He represented a nation that had stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940-1941, that had pioneered combined operations doctrine, that had fielded the world's most professional military force. British military traditions dated back centuries. British imperial experience had shaped modern warfare concepts. British officers had commanded armies on 6 continents. American military traditions were newer. The United States had fought as major power only in World War I, and even then had relied on French and British support for artillery, aircraft, and logistics. American interwar military was small, focused on coastal defense and Philippine garrison. American entry into World War II had required rapid expansion and training of forces that numbered in the millions. But by 1945, American military power was undeniable. American industrial capacity produced weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft in quantities that exceeded all other Allied nations combined. American logistics sustained not just American forces, but provided substantial support to British, French, and other Allied armies. American air power dominated both strategic bombing and tactical support. Churchill's January 18th parliamentary speech, delivered after Montgomery's press conference disaster, carefully calibrated words to repair Allied relationships. The Ardennes battle, Churchill stated clearly, was predominantly an American battle, an American victory, and would be remembered as an ever-famous American triumph. British forces had played supporting roles as coalition partners should. February-May 1945. The war's final months saw Montgomery increasingly marginalized. Allied operations for Germany's conquest were primarily American endeavors. Bradley's 12th Army Group, comprising 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies, conducted the primary offensives. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, comprising British 2nd Army and Canadian 1st Army, operated in northern Germany. American armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945 at multiple points, establishing bridgeheads before German forces could mount coordinated defense. The most significant Rhine crossing came at Remagen on March 7th, when elements of 1st Army's 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact before German engineers could destroy it. This unexpected success provided Americans with a bridge over the Rhine weeks before Montgomery's planned set-piece crossing, Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, executed March 23-24, employed massive artillery preparation and airborne assault to force Rhine crossing in the north. The operation was successful but anticlimactic. American forces had already crossed the Rhine elsewhere, and German defenses were collapsing throughout western Germany. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22nd, one day before Montgomery's operation, after minimal preparation and with light casualties. Patton's message to Bradley: without benefit of aerial bombardment, ground smoke, artillery preparation, and airborne assistance, the Third Army at 2200 hours, March 22nd, crossed the Rhine River, was deliberately sarcastic, comparing Third Army's rapid crossing with Montgomery's elaborate preparations. The final Allied offensive saw American armies advancing deep into Germany. 1st Army and 9th Army encircled the Ruhr industrial region, trapping German Army Group B. 3rd Army drove into Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. 7th Army, operating in southern Germany, advanced toward Bavaria and Austria. British and Canadian forces advanced through northern Germany toward Denmark. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory belonged to an Allied coalition that had overcome Nazi Germany, despite internal divisions repeatedly threatening to tear it apart. In the immediate euphoria, old conflicts were submerged. Montgomery received accolades from a grateful British public. American commanders returned home to celebrations, recognizing their achievements. But in memoirs and histories written after the war, conflicts resurfaced. Montgomery's published recollections, appearing in 1958, reignited old controversies by criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming Montgomery's strategic vision had been superior. These claims prompted responses from American commanders who had maintained public silence during the immediate post-war period. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact with Montgomery, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who seemed determined to re-fight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, meticulously documented instances where Montgomery's conduct had undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously published diary, War as I Knew It, revealed the depth of his contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, drawing on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as talented but difficult, brilliant but insufferable, a commander whose contributions were real, but whose personality made him a liability to coalition warfare. British historians defended Montgomery, arguing that American commanders never appreciated his methodical approach, concern for casualties, and strategic sophistication. The historiographical debate continued for decades. Some historians concluded Montgomery was a great commander poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested American commanders, lacking Montgomery's experience, resented his superior judgment. Still others argued the conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations attempt cooperation in existential struggle. Historical assessment of Montgomery's relationship with American commanders requires acknowledging complexity. Montgomery's military abilities were genuine. His victory at El Alamein reversed British fortunes in North Africa. His planning for D-Day contributed significantly to Overlord's success. His concern for casualties reflected responsible command in an army that could not afford disasters. British soldiers trusted him because he won battles while minimizing unnecessary losses. However, Montgomery's inability to treat American forces as equal partners was equally genuine. Whether this reflected personal arrogance, cultural assumptions, or British determination to maintain fading supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable was that Montgomery's conduct created unnecessary obstacles to coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery provided lessons that outlived the war. Future coalition operations would be structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would be designed to ensure proportional representation and prevent any nation from dominating through superior confidence or historical precedent. American military culture internalized wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. Cold War alliances, particularly NATO, reflected lessons learned from World War II coalition warfare. Command structures emphasized equality, consultation, and mutual respect rather than allowing any single nation to dominate alliance structures. For Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the Field Marshal represented what they believed they had left behind in 1776, the assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to succeed, that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. Montgomery never understood this. To his death in 1976, he maintained his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic vision superior to alternatives. He remained convinced that Eisenhower's leadership had been inadequate, that American commanders had lacked his professional competence, that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. American commanders who survived Montgomery offered different verdicts. They acknowledged Montgomery's tactical skills, but questioned his strategic judgment. They praised his careful preparation, but noted that wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded his concern for casualties, but observed that Montgomery's caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction. And they concluded with near unanimity that Montgomery's personality made coalition warfare more difficult than necessary. The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower, writing years after the war. He acknowledged Montgomery's abilities, but noted the Field Marshal's complete inability to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded, was a man whose military talents were undeniable, but whose lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. This was perhaps the most devastating critique possible, not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues were overwhelmed by vices undermining the cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity for treating allies as partners made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. The Americans learned this through bitter experience from North African sand to German mud. They discovered that military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever his other qualities, could not meet these requirements. And in that failure lay the answer to why American commanders resented Montgomery so deeply. Not because he was British, not because he was cautious, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were winning, soldiers whose blood mattered but whose judgment did not, allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted Montgomery, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance that grew from wartime cooperation. It served as permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect, that battlefield brilliance means little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Montgomery was brilliant tactician, careful commander, British hero. But to the Americans who fought alongside him, he was also a cautionary tale about the limits of military genius divorced from diplomatic wisdom. The question was never whether Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They did. The question was whether Montgomery could recognize theirs. He could not. And in that failure of imagination lay roots of a bitterness that no amount of shared victory could overcome.